So I am Pam Kingsley. I am the chair of the Town of Poughkeepsie Conservation Advisory Commission. And this is the fourth in our series of... one thing I want to say first off is everyone should mute themselves. Yes, awesome. Anyway, this is the fourth in our series, our It Takes a Town series, where we focus on issues of local environmental interest. This month, it is on composting, which we were just saying seems to be very timely. The weather is improving, and I think we're going outside again. I'd just like to say that our guest will be fielding questions at the end of her talk. But so at that point, we'll ask for questions and you just raise your hand and you would be called on. But you can also, in the meantime, if you like, you can put questions in the chat. That would be great. We'll make sure those are covered. And also, I would like to ask you, we have 2 more months of this. Next month, we will be covering solar for our rental and for homes and rentals. And then our last talk will be on invasive plant species. We will have a presentation on that. And then we're going to be taking a hiatus. But as we think about what we might want to do in the fall and moving forward, what we would appreciate, if there are any topics of interest to you, if you could please, again, put them in the chat. We really appreciate the input. So with that, I am going to hand this off to Lorraine Mirabella, who looks like, are you there? Oh, you're right in front of me. Lorraine Mirabella, who's going to do the introductions.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'd like to introduce Joyce Tomaselli, who's a community horticulture resource educator at Cornell Cooperative Extension, and she's highly qualified in many ways. I've heard her speak, and she's really excellent. I want to thank her because this is the 4th Zoom today for Joyce. So she's quite a busy lady. She also handles the hotline for CCE from the office, and I imagine she's quite busy. So thanks, Joyce, for keeping us, on your schedule. Thanks very much.
Pleased to be here. And in 2 weeks, we have our plant sale. So if you don't know about the plant sale, go to cceduchess.org events, because it's online with curbside pickup. So thank you for asking me to join you. We at CCE for the last several years have been pleased to help people understand home composting. And we started this project with support from Dutchess County when there was quite a focus on solid waste reduction. And we also then helped with recycling. And as I've talked with a lot of gardeners, I also added some science in it on when you have successfully composted, what is it that organic matter does to help you with your soil? Okay, so I'm going to work in some soil science here. And you'll notice that when we use the word compost, I suppose I should share, shouldn't I? I'll get there. When we use the word compost, we use it as a verb, we use it as a noun, we talk about home composting. When I talk about managing the decomposition of materials, I'm going to say composting. When we get into the science, I'm going to try and be really more precise about organic matter, because that's the end result, and it has specific qualities that we want to understand, which gives us even more reason to compost. So let me share, and I hope you can see the full screen here. And as I said, this is the benefits of organic matter in home garden soil. A lot of our materials are from Cornell's Solid Waste Management Institute, from which this artwork is also borrowed. Compost, don't treat your soil like dirt. Dirt is soil that is dead and displaced. Soil is living and what we grow things in. So why do we compost? Then how we compost, then I'll side trip a little bit about soil such that then we can understand the value of organic matter in soil with a last explanation about pH, which means percent hydrogen. We compost because an incredible amount of our waste stream is either recyclable or compostable. These facts and figures are from a few years ago, and they really haven't changed. They're from a national survey, and when I look at the details within Dutchess County, we track almost identically with this, right? And if you look at it, paper is compostable, food is compostable, yard trimmings are compostable, wood is compostable, and the rest, I touched the button the wrong way. The rest are recyclable. Now, recycling has gotten a little goofy in the last couple of years as we have changes because of how recyclables are processed. But home composting is really straightforward. And when we take compostable items out of the waste stream, at the end of the day, we have cleaner land, air, and water and a more sustainable environment. So that's one of the why composts. When we look again at what was recycled or composted, there was quite a lot that was recycled or composted, both in yard trimmings and food, et cetera. And when we look at that, it is if we got 39 million cars off the road by taking away the waste and the emissions. So we have made good progress, but a lot more can be done. Only 8% of the plastic was actually recycled, and only 6% of food was actually composted. And again, these are like 5 years old now, but we have been tracking with that locally. Our benefit in Dutchess County, although many of us, when it was built, we were cringing, but the waste to energy facility down on the river is really good in that we don't put as much of our waste into landfill as many other areas around here. We still do some, but a lot of it is converted to electricity. This is the final thing on stats I wanted you to look at. I mean, place yourself in your awareness about recycling and composting. And from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we really had negligible composting to more and more composting. We had very little recycling to more and more. We're generating more and more waste. And yet we've hit a plateau. Since 2000, our nation is not doing any better, is not making progress on what's actually going to landfills. And it's time for us to say, wait a minute, we can do this better. So the first reason on why compost is to not put this into the waste stream. The second you'll see is because there's many uses for compost. So it lowers municipal solid waste volumes. There you go. It improves our soil. And when we have better soil, we have healthier plants. And when we have healthier plants, we have less diseases. And when we have less diseases, we're less likely to reach for a pesticide or an herbicide or an insecticide, which is bothering our pollinators, which you learned about last month. The whole cycle of life is important for us to realize sometimes doing less makes things better. So having better soil and plants overall, especially because more and more people are doing vegetable gardening, right, helps us overall with our environment and all the things about it that we can control. When we have good soil with the proper amount of organic matter, I'll tell you how much that is, it helps soils both retain water and drain better, which goes to better plants. And I'm going to talk about that when we talk about structure. We also have many uses in gardens and our own lawns. So one of the first people, I forgot which person said it, said, I just chop up my leaves and I leave them on the lawn in autumn. Perfect. We've got mulching mowers now. If you chop them up fine enough and don't leave too big of a layer, that is beautifully decomposing over the winter. If we leave a lot of leaves under our trees and under our shrubs, they're helping keep the roots warmer so that the plant is healthier in winter. They're helping reduce water evaporation when it's really cold. And again, they're helping the soil. We will see again how we use it in soils. So we compost because we have many uses for the resultant product. So I'm going to describe now what we mean by composting and then get into some of how it works, some rules about the materials and how we manage the variables. And this also image is from Solid Waste Management with its wonderful, happy people composting in many ways. Okay, end of the day, everything that was once living decomposes. Our bodies, our plants, anything that was once living. It might decompose quickly, it might decompose slowly, it might have other side effects along the way, but basically managing the decomposition is what we're doing when we're doing compost. When we do home composting, we are using oxygen requiring systems because we are depending upon macro and microorganisms to actually do the decomposition. Okay? When you look at high scale industrial composting, they're using anaerobic. They're getting things really hot. It kills everything that's inside there. And sometimes they're capturing methane and other side products from that process that can be used, again, for energy, but they're doing it in a different way. With home composting, we need the pile to be living, and it's usually small scale, so that we are limited in what we can put into it because we don't get it hot enough to get rid of pathogens and diseases and seeds that are unwanted, okay? Managed decomposition. When we're standing at the fair, depending upon how chatty people are, we can talk about this one thing for 5 minutes or 10 or longer and explain everything there is about composting. I won't spend that long, but here's the deal. Often when you talk about programming or when you talk about processes, you've got input, you've got process, and you've got output. Well, the input in this process is we have organic materials, we have the living macro and microorganisms that are doing the work, and we have to have water because they need that to survive. We have decomposition that goes on, and I'll get there in a sec. We have water evaporating, we have heat evaporating, and we have some carbon dioxide evaporating. We have to have air coming in because just like water, these living things need air, water, and a shelter. When we're all done, we have this wonderful, fresh smelling, crumbly, beautiful substance called compost, or scientifically organic matter. So the things that are doing all the hard work here, the beginning is the fungi, the bacteria, and the molds. Picture when you've got lettuce in your refrigerator too cold or too long, it starts molding, right? It starts decomposing, right? In the fungi and the bacteria that start feeding on that are just doing the little bit of decomposition. And as they work, they're emitting heat. That heat is one of the things we depend upon in our compost pile. As they are growing, they are feeding the next layer called the shredders and grazers, which are little insects, worms, nematodes, and other things that are feeding on these, which are feeding on the materials. We go up and we get the other invertebrates like millipedes, sow-bugs, and earthworms. When we have, and this is all the food chain here, this is all showing a lot of the interactions between these living beings within this structure. They're dependent upon each other, and if any of them are unhappy, they're all unhappy. So what we see when we think about a healthy compost pile is where this is all interconnected and all mixed well. And I'll tell you in a couple of minutes why and when we turn the compost pile. And I tell children that's because fungi, bacteria, and molds don't have feet. They can't move very well. So if you do nothing, it will eventually decompose. If you are more proactive, it will decompose more quickly. So my first compost was, I leave my grass really long because I'm at the fair in August. All right. So September and October, I let my grass go really long. I cut all the leaves up at about 4 inches. Then I mow to 3.5, or 2.5 inches. And I gather all of that and put it in a heap. And by August, the Dutchess County Fair the next year, that's my beautiful compost that I have doing nothing. But that's because I cut it all up and I had a perfect mix of browns and greens, and we'll tell you about that. So when we have a healthy living compost pile, at the end of the day, sooner or later, we're going to have nice, rich organic matter. So let's talk about the materials. The slang that we use is browns and greens. And this is the basic feedstock. These are the basic materials that you put into your compost pile. The browns are the ones that are really high in carbon. They tend to be drier. It's your leaves, it's wood chips, it's wood shavings, it's newspaper, it's cardboard, okay? The greens tend to be higher in nitrogen. Think about your kitchen scraps. Think about your lawns. Think about your weeds. Think about your garden materials that you dispose. The greens and the browns are what you need to understand. The browns are used by those shredders and decomposers for food. And the greens are used for their growth and their reproduction. If they don't have both, it's not sustainable, okay? These are examples of high in carbon, high in nitrogen, and then more neutrally. It's a ratio of carbon to nitrogen. So here we've got less carbon to nitrogen. Here we've got a lot of carbon to nitrogen. That's the C to N ratio. Our happiest mix is about 30 to 1, 30 or 35 to 1. So if you just have a lot of clippings from your garden, if you just have a lot of weeds from your garden and you throw it in a pile, you've got a really nice ratio. If I take my leaves and I take my grass, I've got a really nice ratio. Most people, when I say at the fair, do you compost well, when they say no, is because they've gotten very enthusiastic about fruit waste, vegetable scraps, and a lot of garden scraps, and they're not remembering about their browns. Okay, so the next rule of thumb is every time you put a bucket of green in your compost pile, think about 2 to 3 buckets of brown. And it can be any one of these brown things. I sit on a computer all day long, and half the evening I come home, pour a martini, and open the New York Times. I read it on newspaper. I'm old and I get to do that. And now I have newspaper for my compost pile. You can use any newspaper. You can use the garden flyers. You can use the shopping flyers. You can save your leaves. Some people will take their leaves. I now have a newer compost area, and on one side I have all my leaves and grass, and all winter I keep putting my food, and then I use some of that to mix in. So every time you've got a bucket of green, think about 2 to 3 buckets of brown. And then you're going to layer it. You're going to first build your structure with the ability to have air coming in from the bottom, because those macro and microorganisms need air. Then you're going to start layering your browns, your greens, and tucking some browns around the greens. It keeps it from packing down too much. It looks better to your neighbor or your spouse. And it takes away some of the smell that might be repulsing someone or attracting something. And you keep layering it like that. And you could do nothing more than that, and eventually it'll decompose beautifully. You don't compost some things realizing that we're oxygen requiring and cold, okay? If you have seedy weeds or invasive plants that spread by roots or spread by seed, or if you've got your really beat up tomato plants from the end of the year that have all sorts of late blight on them, don't put them in your compost pile, because we, as most home gardeners, don't get it hot enough to kill those pathogens or kill those seeds. And now when you happily use that in your garden next year, you might have just happily spread all sorts of Jimson weed seeds that's now growing in your garden. Right? So when you're happily taking garden material, just stop and think. If it's a grass that's going to seed, put it over on a brush pile for the pollinators. Don't put it in your compost. Diseased potatoes or tomatoes is very specifically a caution because late blight of tomato is the same as the blight that caused the potato famine, the Irish horrible potato thing. And that is something that lives in our environment if it doesn't totally freeze over winter. I'm saying that badly. If you have a big compost pile and you put diseased, especially potatoes, tomatoes in there, and it's big enough that it's staying slightly warm over the winter and not freezing, you really can be spreading quite a bad disease. So just don't do that. Chuck them somewhere else. We don't put dog and cat manure in because the animals that we live with, you don't want the possibility that there's pathogens that then could be transferred to vegetables or food. It's not horrible, but it's a bad habit. Oh, and I have little thingies that come up. There we go. It's usually not hot enough to destroy them. Okay. We don't do dairy, grease, fats, meat, fish, bones, because they're going to take too long to break down. And that's when you're going to attract pests. That's when you might get raccoons. That's when you might get opossums. You might think they're lovely. Your neighbor might think not that it's so lovely. And it's very funny when they teach agricultural composting, everything that's alive break down, right? So you can do mortality composting, where if you have deer that the highwaymen pick up, or if you have cattle that have died, you basically cover them with a couple of feet of wood chips, and they decompose quite nicely. But then the teacher says, but don't use that in your garden because you'll be surprised when you get bones. It's like, okay, I won't use that in my garden. They break down too slowly. Wood ash is something that I've personally seen people really goof up their soil. We're all solar at home and geothermal now, but we used to have wood that we heated the house with. And I had a series of garbage cans that were metal that I waited 2 weeks before I dumped the ashes out in the woods so they weren't hot. I have seen people really use wood ash in their soil. And if they use too much, the soil can become very alkaline. You can have chunks of wood that did not burn all the way, and it's not a good habit. A little bit is okay, but it's not a good habit to get a lot. And you never burn you never use charcoal ashes, because charcoal briquettes may have been treated to get them to burn fast. And then you don't use coated or treated paper. My rule of thumb is use everything from the New York Times, but not the fashion magazine, because some of the glossy print on thicker paper could still be using print that has some chemicals. But back when we started getting all the time colored ads in our plain old newspaper was when they moved to soy dyes. And that's perfectly safe. So we talked some about the materials, browns and greens, 1 part green, 3 parts browns, what not to do. Let's look at a couple of other things that I mentioned and make sure that you realize that. We have to have the air for all those living entities within the compost pile to be able to live. And when you're proactive about managing your compost, you turn it. If you don't turn it, you eventually will have all decomposed at the bottom and all dead at the top, in sort of a maybe living area in between. But you'll keep it all living if you turn it. So basically, you want to monitor how moist it is, or what type of materials you have, or kind of poke a fork in there and see what's going on. We have to have enough moisture to sustain those creatures, but not too much. So if you squeeze it and you're getting dripping, you've got too much water. If you squeeze it and it's dry, not a good idea. So here's one of the things you can do for managing moisture. Just trust Mother Nature. If you've got the place, site your compost pile under a deciduous tree. That will keep it moister in summer because it's shaded. It will keep it warmer in winter because it's deciduous, and you'll have more activity going on year round. You'll have natural rain, You might, in the heat of summer, need to add some water, or you might let it go just a little quiet late summer. But if you've got the area, that's a real good trick on where to site your compost pile. The variables next I want to talk about is surface area. And I tried for a while to use the analogy that a huge block of ice takes a long time to break down compared to ice cubes, but wood chips and sawdust works out a little bit better. Remember those bacteria and the algae, the fungi and everything, they're working on the little edges that they can get to. So if you have a lot of big pieces of material, there's less surface for them to work on. If it's too small, it doesn't hold air. If you've ever had a big pile of sawdust, that got wet, it mats. What we do at the Farm and Home Center when we're not locked to the public, when we normally did, was we had a bucket in our break room, our lunch room, where we threw our food scraps. And just down the road is a woodworker. And the secret is you take a bag and there's a place out back where all the wood shavings are. And that's what we used, the bag of wood shavings. So you put the kitchen bucket in and you put the wood shavings in. And that's a very nice mixture. Back to newspapers, back to other papers. The more you shred them, because I want to get to that, the more you rip them, the more quickly the decomposition can happen. So if you put the newspapers on one way, you can get really nice strips. If you want to get frenetic, you can cut up your cardboard, but that's the same sense. The next variable is temperature. And this is where the first meeting I went to in Ithaca, it was way cool. There were about 30 people, and one guy was trying to get food waste management for a big stadium in Manhattan, or in greater New York somewhere. A couple of guys were local Tompkins County, and they were talking about the big equipment they had. And there were two ladies from New Paltz that wanted to have a business where they were taking food waste from, where is Stevens, Hoboken, and bring it up to New Paltz and manage the decomposition. And they were bragging how quickly they could decompose food waste. So this is bragging. This is, if you're really good, in 60 days, you can go from start to finish. I don't think many people do that, but you can. However, what you're thinking about in terms of the time cycle here is, as the decomposition starts, those macro and microorganisms are generating heat. They get to a point, though, where they can't access a lot of new material, and that heat starts to drop. Okay? In this first phase, you really like it if you can see the heat from this mesophilic to this thermophilic state get to about 90 to 150 degrees. And that's because that's when pathogens and other things are killed. The NOFA, North America Organic, whatever, the commercial requirement for certified compost is 151 to 170 degrees for 5 days. And that's when truly everything is killed. So if you can get your temperature up and then you see it dropping, that's when you turn it. And that's when you now will have new access, and this will happen a few different times. Eventually, when you turn it, you're not going to see that heat spike. And that says that it's almost done and you can let it go into a curing phase. Now, I'll show you some tricks in a minute. I was asked in one of my presentations, how do you know? For like $30 or $300, the more you spend, the more it's worth. For about $30, you can get a compost thermometer from almost any of the garden stores. You just stick it into your compost and it tells you what temperature you're getting. So if you want to monitor until you get experience, that's something you can do. So I will get into structures in just a second, but the basics of how we compost is browns and greens in the structure that has air, has food, and has a house, and the output of the finished compost with the 1 part grain to 2-3 parts brown. We have our macro and microorganisms. People used to buy starters. I will make the point, I think, when we look at structures, that if you're working on soil, you don't need a starter. You've got it right there, because these are things that are naturally in the soil. Make sure that you don't get too dry, and you can add oxygen by turning the pile. So let's look at some units. This is kind of a Cadillac, where ideally you have 3 bins, each of which is 3 by 3 by 3, 3 feet by 3 by 3 cubic feet. And that's because that is generally large enough that you can get that heat buildup, and you can really have good rapid decomposition. This is a very snazzy one, which was built by a carpenter. You can also go get free pallets, which are 3 feet by 3 feet. You can band them together, and you now have your system. If you're worried about animals, you can throw one on top, and you still have it. The deal is that you put your first things into the first bin. When it's full, you turn it into the second bin and fill the first. When the second bin is full, you turn it into the third. You turn this into here, you turn this into there. And about 2, 3, 4 months later, you have really nice compost to use, or you can be storing it there. You can use this first one to store leaves over the winter. Use this one for your food scraps, right? So it's a really nice, and it's also short enough that even I'm not short, but you can get into it to turn it. And you can be snazzy and do it such that these boards, see this board here? This carpenter made it so that the boards could be removed. So that's a nice system. The first system I had when we built it, I just had 2. And what was always frustrating is that it was a little bit too narrow for my Kubota bucket. So we built another one. Well, after they put in the solar, they sort of backed into it and they killed it. But we built another structure that's wide enough now that I can actually get the bucket in and I can turn it. And that helps me. This is a tower unit. And I'll tell you in just a second about something that Dutchess County offers. This is a tower unit. It's empty. It's open on the bottom. So you have a natural migration here of your microorganisms. This opens up or it comes off. You put your scraps and your browns in here, and then this little door in the front slides up. And the theory is that you can take your shovel and you can shovel out the finished compost. It's really good for a smaller household. It's really good if you don't have much area in your backyard or at your apartment, because it's smaller. It's a little smaller than 3 cubic feet, so it doesn't get as hot. And it's kind of funny to turn. This is a turner that when you push this into the bottom, these little things flap out and they help you turn it. The other thing you can do is you can fill it and then you can move it and you can just fill it again. Now, Dutchess County Solid Waste Management does sell a nice unit like this. It's round, it's a little bit shorter, it's a little bit wider, and it's a little bit easier to use. I checked with Lindsay Carrill, they have them, they're stocking them. If you just look Dutchess County compost bins, I believe they're $55. And she said, absolutely, contact Dutchess County Solid Waste Management, and they have compost bins for sale. When you're finished making this, you can use it as an amendment, and I'll get more into that. You can use it as a mulch, as we talked about on our lawns. You can use it as on our lawns, you want maybe 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch. You want to see the grass in autumn. You can use it as a weed suppressant by having more like 1 inch, and that will be very nice in your vegetable garden to suppress weeds. Whenever you mulch, do keep it away from the stem of the plant, because otherwise you're just making a nice place for diseases or animals to hide. You can add it to potting mixture, top dressing, there's all sorts of things. I'm going to get into the details. So what can go wrong? It can just plain never heat up. It can smell. It can get too wet. Nothing happens. That's kind of like stone cold. I'm looking at it, it's looking at me, nothing has happened. You can get bugs. You can get more bugs. And you can have animals. I used to have a rat or a mouse and someone shrieked once when I was presenting, so I put in a bunny. So it all goes back to the balance of your greens and your browns and the size and the water, etc. It could be that nothing is happening because it's winter. It could be nothing is happening because it's finished. It could be because you don't have a good mixture. So kind of think through the basic rules. If they're not breaking down and you kind of fluff it up and you find that it formed a matted layer, then you're not getting rain through and you're not getting oxygen through. If it smells yucky, you've got too many greens and it's probably rotting instead of decomposing. Rotten eggs, you need more oxygen. If you've got insects that are the shredders and the grazers and some beetles and some centipedes and some worms, that's good. If you have ants or if you have yellow jackets or you have wasps, it got too dry. One of the first years I was teaching this, there was a school, they got a grant, they got a greenhouse, a little greenhouse, they started composting, they started their plants for the children in the greenhouse. They didn't realize in May how hot the greenhouse got, their plants all fried. They decided to do better next year. They started the compost, they put it underneath an overhang so that it would be good over the summer. And when they came back, it was filled with wasps. That was not a good experience for the school. They had to kind of start over. So if you have, it's too dry, that's where you could have ants or wasps. So this is just some examples. So without just speaking more quickly, I'm going to be succinct about soil and organic matter and the effect on soil and why we do this. Good topsoil, when it's drained, is mostly minerals. It's a quarter air, it's a quarter water, and it's a little bit of organic matter. You can ruin your soil by putting in too much organic matter. You really can. So what we need to understand is how we use organic matter and how it helps. New York State, if you ever have a chance to study geology, I did when I was unemployed in 2009, is really interesting. And we have some really old rock here up in the Adirondacks. We have some really old rock down in Bear Mountain. We've got some beautiful farming area because of what the glaciers did. We've got this fjord called the Hudson River that formed when water made Lake Albany and cut down through to the ocean. Long Island is a pile of rubble. In any case, that is what originally determines our soil. And over the years, weather and rain and mankind modify those minerals. Eventually, we get horizons. And you can have a soil scientist talk for hours about soil and horizons. And I watched one person 2 years in a row put an entire arena, auditorium to sleep when he talked about soil for 3 hours. So we'll keep it simple. The soil horizons that we're worried about is where our roots are. With a vegetable garden, it's a little bit. With a tree, it's a little bit more. But that's where the roots need their structure, and that's where they need nutrients, and that's what we can manage. Not all soils have all the horizons. I do live on rock. I'm in the town of Clinton. I officially am on rock, and I build raised beds. The texture is one characteristic of soil which is important. That 45% of the soil is minerals, and they're of different sizes. And it's called sand, silt, and clay, and sometimes gravel, or where I live on rock, glacial debris. And the texture is the proportion of sand, silt, and clay. And the texture helps or defines how the soil acts in terms of holding water and how it can exchange nutrients. The organic matter doesn't affect texture. We'll see how it affects structure. This is a very, very classic soil science pyramid with 3 ways of variables. And it's basically telling you that if you have lots and lots of clay where your soil feels very sticky and where it holds all sorts of water, and when it dries out, it's like clay, right? Like a clay pot. That is because it's 100% clay. If we have silt, that would be like the bottom of a swamp. It's a lot of very small material, and then we can have sand. Our ideal garden soil is what's called loamy. And so this helps you to determine what you do if you are at clay and you want to get to loam. And loam is best because well, it's best because it's what our plant needs. If we have all sand, think about it, not much grows in it. Think about the beach, grasses grow in it, some poplars grow in it. If it's easy to erode, materials can leach through it, and it has a real hard time getting nutrients to our plants. Of the 5% so soil has 5% ideally organic matter. That 5% is mostly humus, not humus, that has 2 M's, humus. That's the scientific name for the very dead, stable product of decomposition. It has about 10% of biomass, which we call almost dead, which is a few things that haven't decomposed all the way. And it has about 15% of still the living. And that's what's going to give the biodiversity, the biomass, the livingness of our soil. What organic matter does is it gives a sponginess to our soil. And there's a scientific soil thing that is arrangements of aggregates. They're known as PEDs. And depending upon the type and the size of the PEDs, you have platy if it's been plowed too many times, or you have columnar soil science. But that sponginess provides a place for not only the mineral materials, but also the nutrients and the air and the biomass. So this picture here is pointing out that biology, botany, I studied math and computer science, so plants manage water. If they've got too much, they rot. If they have too little, they wilt. There's all sorts of complexity on how they manage water. And when they uptake nutrients, they're taking it up from the soil solution that's in this spongy soil. And it's very complicated and it's very difficult, and you can study biology and botany to understand it more. When we have nutrients that are in the soil solution, they try to get a balance. They will go from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration and vice versa. And those solutes those solutes include the nutrients that our plants need. The phosphorus, the potassium, and some of the other nutrients, and I didn't get into details for tonight because I'm looking at time. Vastly simplified. This is clay and organic matter, and the cation, the ionic charge of clay and organic matter is negative. And the ionic charge of a lot of the nutrients that are needed is positive. And when we have organic matter or clay in our soil, we have the nutrients disassociate from those mineral materials and get into the soil solution. Clay is very hard for plants to live in because it gets so matted, but clay and organic matter both have this capability. And so what you have is you have a lot of movement of those nutrients, and then through transpiration up to the leaves and transportation back down to the roots, the plant now gets those nutrients. When they need those nutrients, when there are more outside the roots than inside the roots, they will pick up the right nutrients that they need. Sort of magic. There's one but, and that is the pH of our soil, percent hydrogen. This is another very classic chart. And I just want to tell you that in Dutchess County, unless something has been badly damaged with urban activity or construction activity, or you're gardening in what used to be a swamp, the pH that we have is almost always between 6 and 7. And that is where our plants pick up all the nutrients that they need in an even manner. If you have pH that's too high, they can't pick up things like iron and they get chlorosis. If you get pH that's too low, they can't get things like phosphorus. And so you have, It's leaves, roots, and fruits. It's leaves, fruits, and roots. One of them is roots and one of them is fruits, but you don't have a good growing. And then there's a couple of unusual plants like blueberries that do want acidic soil. So when we've got good pH, and we're very fortunate that we have good pH, we now have plants that can pick up those nutrients. Therefore, organic matter makes soil spongy, and it gives spaces for water and air. And that helps it manage the water when it needs it and drain the water when it doesn't want it. And it helps those macro microorganisms get the air that they need to. And it provides space for those still living macro microorganisms that are that 5 to 15% inorganic matter. It helps key nutrients detach from the mineral material and get into the soil solution that plants can pick it up. So we compost to create organic matter, which makes our soil healthier, which is the second to last slide. We can reduce solid waste if we compost our waste, and it's really easy to do. And it creates something that improves our health. There's not a lot of organic matter in good soil. So if you're a gardener, you can use the organic matter that you created to mulch your vegetable plants, keep the weeds down. You pull out your vegetable plants in autumn, you turn it into the soil, and you're ready for next year. It'll keep decomposing in the soil. You can use it in lots of different ways. So we talked about texture and structure, and we talked about how plants then bring up the nutrients. We compost because a rind is a terrible thing to waste, and there's lots of resources that are available. Tompkins County, CCE Tompkins in Ithaca, has a master composting program that they teach that hosts a lot of this information. I can send this to you, and I think these links are live. I also have a brochure which has information that I can share with you. And here's more really good resources that were used when this was created by the Dutchess County Master Gardener Volunteers. Now I'm available for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Joyce. That was really wonderful. That was great. I'll just kick this off. I see that there's one question from Susan in the chat, which is, so if you have a tumbler that isn't in contact with the ground, you can't get the worms, etc. Is that a bad approach?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I shortened the material. So tumblers, and I have a little game with myself every year at the fair. You either hate them or you love them. The majority of the people don't love them. Once it's full, it gets heavy and it's hard to turn. They're expensive. You can't see what's going on inside. And you don't have the benefit of Mother Nature with the rain, with the air, and with being on the ground. You can go into your forest, go into your garden, take some soil, ladle it into there, and now you've got those macro and microorganisms. You really need to make sure that every grain you've got, you're putting in browns. I talked with a private school that invested in a pretty sophisticated system with a huge tumbler. And after 3 years, it just wasn't working and they just weren't getting enough browns and it was wet slop. But you can do it if you pay attention to what you have and then you use some living soil or some living forest stuff. And those are the people that love it.
I think actually, Susan, the question about charcoal ash ended up getting answered in the course of the,
What about
Yeah, so-
untreated? What about untreated charcoal?
oh,
I
like,
know-
like lump hardwood.
Like if you
charcoal.
buy charcoal for a grill, you can get the kind that is like treated to start quickly and all that. What if you just get the untreated? Are those also actually
Yeah.
probably treated?
Then I would not be as concerned about the chemicals, but I would also ask you to look at what you're ladling out from the bottom of your grill. It's dusty, so that's not necessarily helping your texture, right? It's a okay way to get rid of it if you want to get rid of it somewhere, but in volumes, it's really not helping your soil just in terms of its texture, and there's nothing alive to decompose. So if you've got chunks of unburned, I don't know that they actually decompose because it by nature is dead, right? Oh, here's a question I got asked. Eggshells, are they okay? And absolutely. And then they asked, are they browns or greens? I'm thinking, I don't know. I looked it up. They're calcium. They're neither a brown nor a green. So if you've got eggshells, crumple them with your hands because they're not going to aggressively decompose. If you put them in your soil, they're going to be fine. Eventually, they will be adding a little bit of calcium. But if it makes you feel good to put them in your compost pile, go ahead. If you're worried that they're going to attract pests, then put them into your garbage.
Okay. And then we have a question. Can you talk about good earthworms and bad earthworms?
Oh boy, and I will keep it. I'm going to give you 3 answers. Okay. I'm going to give you 4 answers. The first answer is that there are very few, if any, native earthworms in New York. The Wisconsin ice sheet killed them all in the Ice Age. Some are starting to come back, but the majority of the worms that we know today were brought over by colonists. Okay. The native, okay, I'm going to do a second thing. I didn't touch on vermicomposting. Vermicomposting is a system that you can have in a house with a lot less volume, and you use something called red wiggler worms that don't survive our winter. So you can buy them online and you're not introducing an invasive pest. Cool. People either love vermicomposting or get bored after a year or so. There are okay worms that were brought over by the colonists that are from Europe, that there is the European earthworm that tends to tunnel really deep. It comes up in spring and fall. It lives quite a while. It provides some air in the soils. Darwin proved to us that we like these earthworms. They're fairly innocuous. There are other European earthworms that are just below the surface, and they're doing good things to the soil. 1, 2, 3. The fourth is there is an invasive worm called jumping worms, an Amanthus species, which we became aware of them in the Northeast about 5 to 6 years ago. The states that were around the Great Lakes became aware of them earlier than that, and they're fairly well known in the South. They are invasive. They are prohibited from being sold in New York. Hopefully people aren't buying them as bait. They were spreading in the Great Lakes because people were buying them for fishing bait and then dumping them. They live in the top 2 to 3 inches of soil, and they are aggressive decomposers of anything carbon. And they create a layer of castings, which are super high pH. Seedlings can't live in them. It's highly erosive, and it can really kill your soil. I and others around New York, now lots of scientists, lots of researchers became aware of these. There is concern in the turf industry because of golf courses. I don't know of concerns in agriculture because I think we plow too often. There's concerns in forestry because the forest duff is starting to be decomposed. There's currently nothing that is available for homeowners or commercial owners to control these worms. And we're really trying to tell people, clean your boots, clean your tools, don't share plants. And if you bring in soil and you see large, they're called jumping worms because they thrash. If you see large worms in late summer when it's hot, they're not earthworms. European earthworms want cool. They're probably jumping worms, and contact me or others, and we're trying to map them around New York State. We became aware of them recently. Scientists think that they have been in our area for years. There's a story of when platypus were brought to the Bronx Zoo, they brought worms to feed them. And that's one theory. And I have met a man who comes to the fair every day, who grew up right in downtown Poughkeepsie, who remembers that when you got worms, you didn't use those because the fish didn't like them. So if you want to learn more about jumping worms, I can give you a whole presentation on that. Ooh, there's a topic. But yeah, so there are good worms, there are bad worms, and we should be aware not to move worms, especially if they're very active in late summer.
Joyce, I have two questions. You mentioned using pallets for the structure. I thought I read something about pallets harboring bad insects when they come in from foreign countries on container ships.
They could, except now it's regulated that all the pallets have to be made from dried kiln wood. And that is because of the global shipping industry. And so they're not treated with chemicals, they are treated with heat. And so it's okay to use those, and they're awfully pretty good wood. Awesome.
You showed wood chips mixed in with food scraps. I have a lot of wood chips, but unfortunately, it was due to my ash tree being taken down due to emerald ash borer. So are those chips that are left on my lawn diseased from the ash borer?
No, it's okay. The ash borer was laying eggs on living trees. The larvae hatched and they killed that tree because of their zigzagging feeding habits. Once that tree is dead, it's a 1-year cycle. Those larvae hatched, the beetles went elsewhere, and now you have a very fragile tree that can break very easily in storms. You are required by DEC law not to move that firewood elsewhere because there might still be larvae in it. But when they're chipped, it's also killed the larvae. So you can use that wood for firewood locally. You can use that in your garden. That pest has moved on.
Thank you.
Okay, and do we have any other questions for Joyce? Susan?
You're still on mute, Susan.
Yeah, I'm sorry. A little different question. So I have noticed, depending on, because we've gotten a lot of takeout in the last year, a lot of takeout, and there's a lot of packaging. And I've noticed that any number of places that are sustainable and with it, like a great example is Main Course in New Paltz. Everything you take out from Main Course says compostable in an industrial composter, which of course is not my pile. And so I end up feeling like I can't do anything with those. And I just was wondering about that whole thing, like where can that go?
When we were doing a lot of work, we were, okay, I'll start again. 5 or 6 years ago, I was trying to find a good source of inexpensive compostable things for home use for I forget the context. It might have been the Walkway Marathon. I forget what. And the compostable in home compost is still pretty expensive. So sustainable that it can be compostable in an industrial compost, almost anything that was once living can be composted in industrial composts. Ulster County Resource Recovery Agency, right across the Kingston-Rhinekiff Bridge, takes food from many of the northern supermarkets. And they probably could also take those compostable materials. And maybe in New Paltz, in Ulster, there is more of a opportunity for those materials to get to that facility. I know that there have been discussions in some towns about doing composting. I've stepped away from that a little bit, so I'm not sure what's going on now. the anaerobic digestion systems that I looked into 5 or 6 years ago were often too big and too expensive for many of the uses around here. So I think the technology is still in transition, and I fear that you're going to have to put those into waste.
There has been an initial meeting. Michelle Gluck was there, a bunch of us from different climate smart task forces to have this was a few weeks ago already. Lorraine, I think you were there. Just a few people just starting this conversation about what can we do in Dutchess County, and a sort of recognition that it would be very hard to do this at town level. But by collaborating, and there was starting to be discussion about doing something in the county, much like over there. So I have hopes we'll get there.
Yeah.
And that the haulers would have to take it.
Yeah, it's complicated. And as I said at the beginning, the recycling situation has gotten complicated. My understanding is Ulster still does a lot more hand sorting, and they're doing their own brokering as opposed to in Dutchess. So there's a lot of transition and a lot of need for people like you to have that conversation.
All righty. Do we have any other questions for Joyce?
I hear Rachmaninoff, which means he's cooking.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, that's a good place to stop this then. So anyway, thank you very much. This was really a wonderful presentation, very inspiring, very informative. And I
So
think
Pam, are you going to start composting?
I may. I have to figure this out. I have to figure out where, but I like the idea of it. I definitely do. So I'll update you at the other end of the season. So
Now I'm wondering whether I put too much carbon in. You know, I do this lawn mowing at the, and I take the leaves and I run them over and over, and then I disperse all the leaves. But after 20 years, there's probably quite a bit of carbon that I put in.
well,
So you can start being more
healthy.
aggressive about you can start being more proactive with your kitchen scraps and use that stored material.
No, but I mean, this is dispersed across the whole lawn with this.
Yeah, but
method.
it's decomposing. It continues to decompose. It's feeding your roots.
Yeah, that's what I was assuming or hoping. I'm
It is.
simply taking all the minerals and everything else in the leaves and just keeping
I think so long probably as your lawn looks healthy, you're good. If it starts looking a little wonky, then maybe then you start considering maybe backing off a little bit. So,
Right. Yeah.
yeah. So, well, anyway, everyone, thank you so much. Thank you for coming tonight. Joyce, again, thank you so much. And Lorraine for putting this together.
Thanks, Lorraine.
And,
Really
and
good.
we'll see a number of you next month for solar.
Yes, we will.
So anyway,
Thanks,
good night,
Joyce.
everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.